Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use the stitching dies 3 ways, and I'm using the Felt Stitch and Create Reindeer as well as the candy cane. And then I'm also bringing in the Gingerbread boy or girl just for that little bow tie there. So the first one that I'm going to create, I'm using the wool felt squares or felt sheets from Spellbinders. I have the holiday color mix or collection here, and I also have the neutral pack. So these have 10 different felt squares in them, so they have a nice color assortment within them, and they feel really nice. They're nice and soft. They're not scratchy or anything. They are wool, which is really nice, and they're really nice to work with. This is the neutral color assortment. So once again, there are 10 felt squares in here. They are 8 by 12. Look at those beautiful greens. I don't use them in this video, but I just absolutely love the different colors in here. I've used several of the different browns for the reindeer, and then I'm bringing in some of the colors from the holiday palette for different accents. So this pink one here is going to be for the little bow, and I'm going to do that for the first reindeer. They die cut absolutely beautifully, and you don't need anything specific to do the die cutting on them. So I'm just using my Platinum 6 here. I typically will cut a piece that's big enough for the dies that I'm cutting out, and then place those dies on top of them, put them through my die cutting machine. Same stacking as just die cutting paper, so you don't need any special stacking or anything. Then I take those dies, and some of the little bits of felt stick in the holes, so you can use a tool in one and that cleans them out really, really well. But the little felt pieces, when you put them in, or when they're in the holes, they're just tiny little fibers, so often you can just rub the dies and it will come off. For the little holes in the actual felt, if there's still some of the felt in there, I find that just flicking that felt takes those fibers out and at least makes it thinner so that you can see through them. You could also use a die pick, but you want to be really, really careful with it because you can tear the felt. They're just little fibers, so you don't want to use too much force with it because it could tear right through. So when it comes to doing my stitching, I'm doing running stitches here, which means I'm going up one hole, down the next, up the next, and then I will go through the whole area that I want to stitch. I will go all the way around, or else if I'm done, I will go back and then fill in the opposite holes that I already did. And I'm always conscious of what is going to be seen on the outside of my piece, and make sure to put knots where they're not seen or have them on the inside of different things. So for this particular bow, I have my knot in the very center of that bow. And when it comes to putting the whole piece together, this little bow tie, the little thing that hangs down is going to cover that knot. So I don't have to worry about it being seen. The other thing too is this bow tie, I'm going to put it on the reindeer's head. So wherever I put it, that's going to hide some things as well. So like I said, I'm always conscious of what is going to be visible, and I make sure that any knots that I create are hidden. So when I do knots for these, I do a little bit of a loop. I thread my needle through the loop, and then I do that 3 times. So I do the first loop, thread my needle through that first loop, and then thread it through the second loop. I have no idea if that knot has a name to it. It was one that I was taught when I was very, very little, and it's usually the way that I knot things off. I'm also using some craft stacks here to hold all my pieces. This one here is the large craft stacks, and I have a large craft stacks panel, magnetic panel in there. It's great for holding any dies that you still want to die cut, and I'm also using it to put my needles or my pins down when I'm in the middle of creating, if I don't want to make, or want to make sure that they don't get lost. I've done a lot of the stitching off screen because it gets very repetitive, and I don't think it's helpful to see the entire thing being put together, because most of it I think is fairly intuitive how it goes together. When it comes to the pieces that go to the front of different things here, I am making sure that the front part is the perfect part, the part that is going to be seen. The back part, again, it doesn't matter if it's seen, or it doesn't matter if it's perfect, because it's going to be in the middle or it's going to be inside the reindeer. So I already did my running stitch around the outside of this face piece, and I'm just going in and filling in those areas. filling in the different stitches. So I'm doing the running stitch to fill in the areas. I found that the way these dies were designed, they were designed with, I think it's an odd number of holes. So it just works out perfectly when you go all the way around once and then you continue your running stitch, it automatically fills in those holes. So it doesn't require any special stitches in order to get those holes filled. It's perfect. So once I've gone around this piece the first time, I cut a pink nose. Originally, I was going to do this as Rudolph and I cut a red nose, but in the middle of this, I changed my mind and decided to use that bow instead. So I changed the color of the nose to a pink nose. I'm still using that brown floss. I'm going to add some little accent pieces on top of that nose. There's also some hoof pieces and some that are specifically left and right. So I wanted to make sure to do the die cutting of those on the video so that I can keep track of which ones are the left and the right ones. They're very, there's minor differences between the two. And really, if you did this die cutting ahead of time, you could always flip your piece over. I would definitely make sure to look at what pieces go where and kind of dry fit them before adding your glue. Anytime I'm not stitching something together, I'm just gluing it with some Barely Art glue in my fine line bottle. This is the same glue that I use for my cards. So I'm not using any special glue to glue that felt. I am, however, making sure to let that sit for a while and let it sit and completely dry before I move on to my next step. So here are my hoof pieces. I've got the base of my reindeer already die cut, and I have the back of the head already stitched to the back of the body. I had originally planned to stitch the head pieces onto the base of the body and then do the stitching all around all of it, and then ended up changing my mind. So the back of the head is on the back of the body already, but doing it the way I'm doing it right now, that's not necessary. You don't have to stick it on. What I do recommend, though, is using some pins to pin things in place. Soon in this video, I use some sewing clips, which are just some clips that hold things while you're sewing and while you're quilting. But I did find that while I was stitching around that head, those clips holding all those pieces together were fairly heavy, and the motion of doing my stitching ended up making them fall off in the middle of the stitching. So pins are definitely better because they are more lightweight, as well as the fact that they don't get into your way as much. You just have to make sure to pay attention to the end of the pin, the sharp end. So I am taking my headpiece, I am matching up the holes, and I'm also making sure that everything goes where I want it to before using the clips in place. Now for the reindeer antlers, I did take 2 pieces of felt and I glued those together so that they were a little bit stiffer. And I did that before going and stitching them all together. The pieces for the ears, however, I wanted to make sure to glue those in place, but I wanted to glue them in place afterwards so that the glue didn't interfere with what I was doing. For the inside parts of my little reindeer here, I have some polyester batting, and what I did to make sure that they were the right size is I used my dies to die cut them, and then I just used my Spellbinders 9-inch shears to cut off the excess and cut just inside of those holes. That way I knew it was going to be the right shape, the right size. And for the die cutting part, it did die cut through most of that. The most important part is it die cut the little holes all the way around, so it made it really easy to know exactly where they would be. And it was an easy way to make sure that that batting was the right size. Now, if you didn't want to do this, you could just use the batting and just stuff it in. Just be very gentle, because like I said before, that felt will tear. It feels very nice and it feels very secure, except for the fact that around all of those outside edges, we have all of those tiny little holes. So the pressure of pushing too hard against those holes with the stitches in it will cause it to tear. So you do have to be gentle when you're doing your stitching and make sure that you're being gentle with those holes. And I found that just doing the regular stitching and going up and down didn't put in too much pressure on them. The only time I had an issue with it was pointed areas, like the points of the little hooves and stuff like that. I sped it up here because it's very, very repetitive. So I'm just going around the outside of the head, going up and down, making sure that the holes are lined up around that head. And then I'm also taking the time to put the little pieces in there and stitch those in place while I'm doing my stitching. Now this is the first line of stitches, so this is the first, or this is the running stitch. And once I've gone all the way around, I'm going to go around a second time, filling in all of those holes. Now, the one thing I wanted to mention is Nicole Spohr, who is the designer for these dies, did create a video on the Spellbinders channel with these different dies. So they're great ones to check out and listen to her helpful tips. I did find them very helpful. Around the second, or on the second way around, I went and I added that bow to the reindeer head. So all I did was I went up with my running stitch, put a stitch through the back of that bow, and then went down through the next hole, so it secured it in place properly. Once I am done going all the way around, for this knot, I hid it in between or in behind one of the little reindeer arms there. So if you lift it up, you could see the knot there, but it's not so obvious that I think anyone would really look. You could also add just a dot of glue to glue that arm down a little bit if you wanted to hide it a little bit more. Now, when this reindeer is finished, it is it is secure. It's not going to fall apart. There's nothing that makes it a hazard because there's no hard things or anything. So this, I think, would be an adorable little decor thing in a baby's room. However, I wouldn't give it to a baby to, say, chew on or teeth on, simply because I don't know what's in the glue that I used, as well as the fact that, as I've mentioned before, that wool felt is fairly delicate and I don't want it getting ruined or wrecked. So I wouldn't suggest this as a chew thing for, or say, a baby, or even say an animal or a dog or whatever. I think it would be demolished a little bit too quickly. So I would just use it as a decor piece. For my second item, I'm using the Stitch and Create candy cane die, but I'm using it with some cotton quilting fabric. I have each one of these backed with some non-woven lightweight interfacing. I wanted to give a little bit of extra structure to that cotton. I wanted to also reinforce it a little bit so that when I'm doing my stitching, it may start to fray a tiny little bit because it's cotton and because it's woven, but it's not going to completely ruin the entire thing. That interfacing is going to give it a little bit of stability. It's very easy to die cut. However, for die cutting this, I am taking a piece of printer paper, folding it in half just to fit the size of my cutting place and putting it underneath the cotton, and that is helping it a lot. And it die cut through any of these pieces beautifully. Once again, I did a bunch of the stitching off screen because it gets very, very repetitive, but I am going to do some of the stitching on screen. So for those two holly leaves here, I did one with my die blade facing the green part of that fabric, and then the second one with my die facing the interfacing part of that fabric, so that I knew that they were going to fit together and the holes were going to line up. When I'm done with my die or with my needle in the middle of stitching, I just put it in my craft stacks on top of that magnetic piece, just to make sure that it is secure. I don't need to worry about it getting lost while I'm doing the rest of my stitching. The other thing that I'm using that interfacing for is when I'm going from stitching one area to another, I just take that needle and just put it through that interfacing a little bit, just to direct my thread so it's not covering the exposed holes on the outside. The other thing with this cotton is I can do several stitches at once. So I can go up and down, making sure that those holes line up, and do, say, a half a dozen stitches or so all at once. And it makes it stitch really quickly and easily. So I did find that stitching the cotton was a little bit easier than stitching the felt. They're both different, as in they have completely different looks. But the one reason why I wanted to use the cotton is I had to order more of the felt, because the felt that I got originally, I didn't have enough to do what I wanted to, especially with that reindeer needing a lot of those neutrals. So I wanted to get some more, and while waiting, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if some of these areas had some pattern to them, which brought me to cotton quilting fabric. So I went to my local fabric store and bought a few different prints that were going to work perfectly for this. And I love quilting fabrics because they have smaller prints in general. So I was able to get some prints that will work for this design. They have that pattern to it, so it has that interest to it, but they're not so bold or obvious prints that it takes away from the entire design. So I'm using some gold metallic thread for this. You could easily use colored floss as well, but because we're working with Christmas stuff, I thought some metallic floss would be beautiful with it. Add a little bit of a metallic touch. Now we're doing the holly, and while I'm doing the holly, I'm doing the center spine, doing just the running stitch, but when it comes to the little lines that go off that center spine, I am going up it and then I'm going back down, making sure to fill in those holes. So once I've gone all the way to the tip of that holly, all that's required is filling in the rest of the running stitch down that center spine. I don't have to go up and down each one of those sides again because they're already completely done. And you can see how quickly and easily it is doing this whole holly piece because I can do several stitches at once. The other thing that I did when I started this piece, I started with a thread of that gold between my two layers. So when I go back, when I've done all of those side pieces, as well as that center spine going all the way back down to the bottom, I'm going to finish with my needle going between the two layers of cotton. And then I'm just going to tie those two pieces of thread together so that the ends of my thread are completely hidden. I could use the front or the back of this leaf and they look pretty much exactly the same. The only difference between the front and the back of the leaf is similar to when you're die cutting cardstock. There's a tiny little difference between the edges of the die cuts. One has a little bit of a rounded curve, just like when you're die cutting cardstock. The other one, the back side, it isn't quite so rounded. However, the fabric is a little bit more forgiving with that than cardstock is. So again, you could use either side. There's just a very slight difference. But I was really impressed with how easy it was to use this cotton with both the dies as well as the stitching. Now I chose some lightweight interfacing for this because I didn't really want to add a whole lot of weight to it, but you could definitely choose a heavier or a thicker interfacing just to get it a little bit more stable. It is still fairly, it's not stiff. So it is still fairly soft. The other thing that I didn't do for this is I didn't add any batting on the inside of it. I definitely could have, just to make it a little bit more dimensional. But I was more curious how this was going to work and in the finished result. And I didn't necessarily want it to be a puffy or dimensional, but you absolutely could. If you wanted that candy cane itself to have a little dimension to it, it's an easy way to add that to it. It's just adding the batting on the inside. And once again, I would do exactly the same thing as I did with that reindeer. I would use my dies to die cut that batting, then use the shears to cut off the excess and cut it on the inside of those holes so that when I'm doing the stitching, I'm not also having to worry about the batting being exposed on the outside. Now, like I said before, I am using metallic floss here, and you could certainly use just plain colored floss. The metallic floss, while it has a beautiful sparkle to it, it is a little bit more challenging for your stitching. It tends to knot a little bit more, as well as the fact that it tends to twist a little bit while you're doing the stitching. What I end up doing is just holding the piece that I'm stitching, let my needle and my thread hang below it, and it will unwind itself. It's not quite as soft as just the regular floss. It's a little bit more stiff, creating that little bit of challenge, but I just love the final look of it. So here is the berries for the holly, and that was done very similarly to the pieces that I stitched onto the holly, and the start and the end of it, the thread is between those two pieces, so they're just knotted together. When it came time to putting my candy cane together, I thought it was going to be more simple to start at the curve of the candy cane, matching those holes. But you'll see when I get to the bottom, I'm off by a hole. So it's actually easier to start at the ends of the candy cane to make sure that all of those holes line up and then work your way up to that curve. I would start at the end of the candy cane, go up a couple of stripes, and then start at the top end of the candy cane and go back down and meet the two different areas, just to make sure you have it all lined up. Pins are definitely helpful here because they hold everything in place, and it's a little bit less to be keeping track of while you are doing your stitching. You only have to worry about doing the stitching. You don't have to worry about keeping those holes lined up because the pins are doing that here. And I just have regular pins, but you could use those quilting safety pins. Those would be great as well to hold everything in place, and then you wouldn't have to worry about those sharp edges. Now, just like the berries and the holly, I started here with the end of my thread between my two pieces. For the white areas, because there's no extra layers on that, it was very easy to go up and down several stitches. For the red areas, because those red pieces are separate pieces on top of the white, I did find that I could maybe do 1 or 2 stitches where I just went up and down, but I couldn't really do much more than that because the holes would start to misalign. So I found that it took a little bit longer for those red areas than the white ones, only for that reason. And I didn't want to have to worry about having stitches that weren't aligned and having to take pieces out. So after going around the outside area of my candy cane twice in order to have all of those holes filled, I am ready to finish this off. So I have my thread still on my needle, and this is the same thread that I've been using to stitch. And I'm doing the same type of technique as I did with that bow, putting it on the reindeer. I have taken a stitch, put a stitch through that through that holly, and then I'm doing the same thing for the next one, tacking it down to that candy cane. It doesn't need to be pretty because I'm only doing it on the top layer. None of this thread is going through the bottom, so it's not visible, but I wanted to have stitches holding all of this together, because to use liquid glue, it would likely just go right through all of that cotton and you would see some exposed glue and it would affect the finish. Stitches are much easier. And like I said, the main thing that I'm making sure to do is making sure that none of those threads are going through to the back. They're just going through to the inside, but it is tacking everything in place. And once I was done, everything was nice and secure. Nothing needed more than just one little stitch here. And then when I was done, I once again put that thread through between the 2 layers of the candy cane, took my needle off the thread, and then just did a double knot to tie them in place, and then took my shears to cut that thread down. And here we have our candy cane with that holly on there. I'm going to use that same thread to do a hanger for this candy cane. I thought it would make a cute ornament or a cute addition to the front of a gift. And I figured I might as well use that same floss simply because it was used to do the stitching all the way around, and it tied in really, really well. Obviously, I didn't have to worry about different golds matching. So here we have our hanger. I'm just putting a knot at the end of it and then using my scissors to trim that excess off. If you wanted, you could do a double layer of this for that hanger just to have it be seen a little bit more. But I wanted the candy cane to be a little bit more visible than the actual hanger. So for our third item, I'm using that same reindeer one again, but this time I'm going to do a card. So here I've used those velvet sheets. I've used them several times in different videos. They have adhesive on the back of them. So when I was doing my die cutting, I put a lot of these pieces onto some scrap cardstock before doing my die cutting. They die cut absolutely beautiful, so I don't have to worry about putting any printer paper underneath them in order to have them die cut. Some of the upper layers, I didn't bother putting scrap cardstock on because I just used the adhesive to glue it onto the piece below. So for instance, the nose, the muzzle on the front of the reindeer's mouth, I just stuck that right down to the base part, making sure any holes lined up. Same with the little light piece on the body, and just use the adhesive that came with that cardstock. But the other pieces that are going to be stuck to my card, I did put that extra cardstock on there. First thing it does is it adds some stability to it. It makes it a little bit easier to do my stitching. The second thing it does is it makes it so it's easier to glue it onto my card, simply because I can just use my glue. I don't have to worry about fighting adhesive while I'm doing my stitching and then using that adhesive and trying to tear off the backing with those holes. So I did a bunch of that or with a time-lapse setting just because it's very, very repetitive. And I also did some of the stitching off screen, once again, because it's very repetitive. Once you've seen this, there's no difference in the stitching. The stitching is all the same for all of the pieces. The only thing, once again, that I keep in mind is where my knots or the ends of my thread are. For this piece here, all I'm using is some Best Ever Craft tape, and I'm just taping the edges of the thread or the ends of the thread on the back just to make sure they're nice and secure. Once I have my nose and my eyes there, I wanted to add a little bit of extra texture. So I'm using some Glossy Accents in a bottle that has a really fine tip. I'm going to put it on the eyes as well as the nose, and then I'm letting that dry before I continue. Now, when it's first on there, it's very, very milky. So I am trying to be careful to make sure that it's completely dry, but you can see that as I'm working on this piece here, I got a little bit impatient. I wanted to continue. It's not 100% dry for the little nose part. It's mostly dry, but I am being very careful to not put anything on top of it because I would mar stuff. So what I'm doing here is I'm gluing down the antlers and the ears. I am creating a 5x7 card. So my card base here is 5x7. My printed paper, this is from the Oh Joyful Day 6-inch paper pad. That is cut to 4 inches by 6 inches. And then I have a crimson cardstock mat behind it that is 4 1/4 by 6 1/4 just to frame it. This deer is a little bit too big to go on a A2 card or 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. And also to add a little bit of extra texture to it, I took those ears, I took a tiny little bit of glue at the base, and I crimped them together and used some of those sewing clips in order to hold those ears and let that glue dry, just to give it a little bit of extra texture. This is one of those, or extra dimension. This is one of those steps that you could absolutely ignore and you could just glue them down flat. I just thought it would look cute, and it's a little bit different from the other ways I've used it. I have my hat here, and I didn't want to glue on the pom-pom part of it until I knew exactly how it was going to be on my little reindeer. Then I put my pom-pom on it. Though the pom-pom and the trim from this hat are die cut out of glitter cardstock, so they do take a little bit of extra time to dry, but I love that extra sparkle that they give. It's absolutely beautiful with that velvet cardstock. And then I have a Merry Christmas sentiment here. It's from the Joyful Christmas Sentiments Glimmer Set. It's foiled in gold foil with my glimmer system. It's one that I had from a previous project. I just thought it would be perfect on the front of this card, finishing it off nicely and adding some metallic texture to it. So here is the finished card. It's just a different way to use those stitch dies by using them on the fronts of cards. And you can do this with any of them, but you do need to accommodate for a little bit larger card to hold the whole thing. But it's a great way to use those dies in a different way. Then we have our candy cane done with some quilting fabric, and I love the different look to it. It does fray a tiny little bit on the outside edges, but it did make it a lot easier to stitch with it by having that interfacing behind there, and I really love the slightly shabby look to it. And then lastly, our adorable felt reindeer. This one is just adorable, and I'm using him on his own here, but you could put him on the front of a pillow or on the front of something, or even in a frame. I think he would be absolutely adorable as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed sharing with you some of the different ways you can use the stitching dies, and I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Have a great day.